Daniel Hawthorne had been 23 years old when the war came calling. He'd been working his father's ranch in Wyoming, building a cabin on a piece of land he'd claimed as his own, and courting Catherine Morrison, the school teacher's daughter who could make him laugh even when the work was hard and the winters were harsh. They'd fallen in love the way young people do on the frontier, quickly, intensely, with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing life is too short and too hard to waste time on hesitation. He'd asked her to marry him in the spring, under that old oak tree that marked the boundary between her father's land and his. Catherine had said yes with tears streaming down her face, and they'd set the date for September, after the harvest came in and before the first snow fell. But in July, the recruitment officers came through town. The war between the states needed men, needed soldiers, needed bodies to fill the ranks. Daniel could have stayed, could have claimed exemption as a rancher. But his father had fought in Mexico and his grandfather in 1812. And when Catherine asked him not to go, begged him to let others do the fighting, Daniel kissed her forehead and told her it would only be a year, maybe less. He'd come home, they'd get married, and they'd start their life together. He'd been so sure, so certain that love and luck would carry him through, so convinced that nothing could keep him from coming back to her. The night before he left, they met under that oak tree one last time. Catherine gave him a locket with her photograph inside and made him promise he'd come home to her. Made him swear on everything they'd built together, every dream they'd shared. Daniel promised, swore he'd rather die than break that vow. And when he rode away the next morning with the other recruits, Catherine stood watching until it disappeared over the horizon, her hand pressed to her heart like she was trying to hold it inside her chest. Daniel meant to write, meant to send letters every week, let her know he was alive, counting the days until he could hold her again. But war swallows intentions like the desert swallows rain. The first battle came faster than expected, then another, then another. The mail wagons were unreliable, constantly raided or redirected. His regiment moved constantly, and by the time Daniel sat down to write, he'd lost track of where to send the letters. He kept fighting, kept surviving, kept Catherine's photograph pressed against his chest through every nightmare. 1 year became 2. 2 became 3. The war dragged on with no end in sight, and Daniel became something he didn't recognize, harder, colder, haunted by the faces of men he'd killed and friends he'd buried. But through it all, Catherine's face remained clear in his mind, his reason to survive, his reason to stay human when everything around him was designed to turn men into monsters. Meanwhile, back in Wyoming, Catherine waited. She kept Daniel's letters, the few that made it through, in a wooden box under her bed, read them until the paper was soft as cloth, told everyone who asked that her fiancé was coming home soon, that they'd get married just like they planned, that love could survive anything, even a war. But months passed with no word, then a year, then longer. Other families started getting letters, official notifications that their sons and husbands had died in battle. Catherine received nothing. No letter, no telegram, just silence that grew heavier with each passing season. Catherine turned them all away. She'd made a promise under that oak tree, and she intended to keep it. Then the winter of the second year came, brutal and unforgiving. Catherine's father fell ill. The doctor's bills piled up, and the school couldn't afford to pay her much. The cabin Daniel had built for him, the one she visited every week to keep the dust off and the memories alive, started to fall into disrepair. The roof leaked, the door hung crooked on its hinges. It was becoming a monument to a future that might never come.
That's when Jacob Sterling started coming around. He was a decade older than Catherine, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 2 years earlier. He owned a successful freight business, had a solid home, and needed a wife to help raise his young son. He wasn't asking for love, just partnership, companionship, mutual survival. Catherine refused him 3 times, but then her father's condition worsened and the medical bills became impossible to manage on a teacher's salary. Jacob offered to help, asked for nothing in return, just wanted to support a neighbor in need. He was kind about it, patient, never pushed, just quietly showed her what stability could look like if she chose to accept it. When her father died that spring, leaving Catherine alone with debts and grief and no word from Daniel in nearly 2 years, she finally understood what the frontier had been trying to teach her all along. Hope is a luxury, and sometimes survival requires sacrifice. She went to the oak tree one last time, told Daniel's ghost that she was sorry, that she'd waited as long as she could, that she hoped wherever he was, he'd understand and forgive her. Then she took off the locket he'd given her, buried it at the base of the tree, and walked back to town to accept Jacob Sterling's proposal. They married quietly in June. No celebration, no joy, just a practical arrangement between 2 wounded people trying to build something stable from the wreckage of their losses. Jacob was good to her, gentle, patient. He never asked her to love him, just to be present, to help with his son, to manage their home. And slowly, carefully, Catherine began to heal. Not from losing Daniel, that wound never fully closed, but from the constant ache of waiting for someone who was never coming back. When she discovered she was pregnant 4 months after the wedding, Catherine felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of her youth, but something quieter, steadier. Maybe this was her second chance. Maybe this child would be the future she was meant to have all along. And then, on a cold October evening, Daniel Hawthorne rode into town. The war had finally ended. He'd survived 3 years of hell, collected his discharge papers, and ridden straight home without stopping. Every mile, every hour, he'd been imagining this moment, seeing Catherine's face when he appeared at her door, feeling her in his arms again, starting the life they'd promised each other under that oak tree. He went to her father's house first, found it empty, sold to another family. His stomach twisted with the first real fear he'd felt since leaving the battlefield. He asked around town, and the responses came with uncomfortable pauses and averted eyes. Finally, the general store owner told him the truth. Catherine had married Jacob Sterling. They live in the big house at the edge of town, and yes, she was expecting a child. Daniel felt something break inside him that no bullet or blade had managed to touch. But he had to see her, had to hear it from her own lips, had to understand how the woman who'd promised to wait forever had moved on in less than 3 years. So he rode to Jacob Sterling's house, knocked on the door, and when Catherine opened it, saw his entire future crumble to dust. The confrontation was quiet at first. Catherine invited him inside, her hand shaking, her face pale. Jacob was away on business, wouldn't be back until tomorrow. They stood in the parlor of a home that should have been theirs, surrounded by another man's belongings, and tried to find words for something that had no words. Daniel wanted to be angry, wanted to accuse her of giving up too easily, of not having enough faith, of breaking the most important promise 2 people can make. But when he looked into her eyes and saw the same heartbreak he felt reflecting back at him, he realized the truth was more complicated than betrayal, more painful than simple abandonment. Catherine explained everything. The silence, the debts, her father's death, the choice between survival and waiting forever for a ghost. She told him about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep clutching his letters, about visiting the cabin until she couldn't bear it anymore, about burying the locket under the oak tree because wearing it while marrying another man felt like sacrilege. She told him she'd mourned him, had accepted that he was gone, had done what she needed to do to survive in a world that didn't care about broken hearts and postponed dreams. And now here he was, alive and whole, and she was carrying another man's child, and there was no way to undo any of it. Daniel listened to this all, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, and then he asked her the one question that mattered. Did she love Jacob? She paused. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the complicated truths that live in the space between yes and no. Finally, she told him the truth. She didn't love Jacob the way she loved Daniel. What they had wasn't the passionate, all-consuming fire of youth. It was something quieter, steadier, built on respect and mutual need rather than dreams and promises. But it was real, and it was hers now, and she'd made vows that she intended to keep. Daniel felt the last thread of hope snap. He stood there in that parlor looking at the only woman he'd ever loved and finally understood what the war had taken from him. Not his life, not his body, but his future. The one he'd carried through every battle, the one that had kept him human when everything else was trying to break him.
Daniel left the house before Jacob returned. He couldn't face the man who'd taken his place, couldn't stand to see the life that should have been his playing out with different actors. He rode to the cabin he'd built, found it just as broken down as Catherine had described, and spent the night sitting on the porch where he'd planned to carry his bride over the threshold. Morning came cold and gray. Daniel sat watching the sunrise over land he'd once claimed as his own and made a decision. He could stay and let bitterness poison the rest of his life, could make things difficult for Catherine and Jacob, could remind everyone of the promises that were broken and the dreams that died. Or he could do the thing that felt impossible but necessary. Let go. He rode to the oak tree, the one where they'd made their promises, dug up the locket Catherine had buried and held it in his palm, feeling the weight of what could have been. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He didn't take the locket with him, didn't pocket it as a reminder of what he'd lost. Instead, he opened it, looked at Catherine's young, hopeful face one last time, and buried it again, deeper this time, in a place where it could rest alongside all the other dreams the frontier had swallowed. Before he left town, Daniel did one more thing. He repaired the cabin, worked day and night for 2 weeks, fixing the roof, straightening the door, making it solid and weatherproof again. When he was finished, he signed the deed over to Catherine and left it with the town clerk along with a note. The note simply said that the cabin was hers to do with as she pleased. Sell it, rent it, burn it down. He didn't care. He'd built it for a future that no longer existed, and he had no use for monuments to dead dreams. Then Daniel Hawthorne rode out of Wyoming and never looked back. He drifted west, taking odd jobs, avoiding anywhere that might remind him of what he'd lost. He never married, never let himself love anyone else, not because he was being noble or romantic, but because the war had taken something from him that couldn't be replaced. not Catherine herself, but his capacity to believe in forever. Years later, he'd hear through the frontier grapevine that Catherine and Jacob had 3 children together, that they'd built a good life, that Catherine had become the kind of woman who quietly helped others, who understood loss in a way that made her kind without being soft, that she'd named her first daughter Grace, after the quality she hoped would see her through the guilt of being happy when happiness felt like betrayal. Daniel never regretted letting her go, but he never stopped loving her either. Some loves aren't meant to survive war, or time, or circumstance. They're meant to teach you something harder and more valuable than happily ever after. They're meant to teach you that love sometimes means letting someone build a life without you, even when it breaks your heart. That survival requires sacrifice, that promises made in peacetime don't always survive the battlefield. The lesson Daniel learned, the one he carried with him until his last breath, was this: life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It doesn't pause while we fight our battles or chase our dreams. And sometimes the cruelest thing it does isn't taking away the people we love, it's bringing us back to them too late, when they've already done the impossible work of learning to live without us. Catherine's lesson was different, but equally hard. She learned that you can love 2 people in 2 different ways, and neither love diminishes the other. That choosing survival doesn't make you a traitor to the past. That guilt and happiness can exist in the same heart, and learning to carry both is what it means to be human. And maybe that's the real story here. Not about betrayal or broken promises, but about 2 people who loved each other enough to survive their own love, who made impossible choices and lived with the weight of them, who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on, it's knowing when to let go. Daniel Hawthorne died alone 30 years later in a boarding house in Oregon. Catherine's photograph still tucked in his coat pocket, a different one than the locket, one he'd bought from a traveling photographer years after he'd left Wyoming. Catherine Sterling died surrounded by children and grandchildren, her husband Jacob's hand in hers, but on her dresser until the very end sat a small wooden box containing the letters Daniel had sent during the war. Both of them carried their love to their graves, but they carried it differently. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Love as fiercely as we can, and when the world demands we let go, do it with as much grace as we can muster. If this tale touched your heart, then don't ride off just yet. There are more stories waiting beneath the western sun. Tales of love, betrayal, and lessons learned the hard way. Subscribe to Frontier Love Tales, where every story reminds us that love still rides, even across the roughest frontier. Because sometimes the hardest ride isn't the one that brings you home, it's the one that takes you away from it, knowing you'll never find your way back.